What's up, guys? It's Drew 6006 with a family video for you tonight. This is part one of the boys scout trip to the Llano Estacada Museum here in Plainview, Texas. So like I said, this is part one. There will be two parts to this entire video because there's a lot of video footage that was shot tonight. But with that, guys, I hope you enjoy this, and here we go.
Time to ask questions rather than asking while we're going, because it can get out of hand in a hurry. So we get off subject. So I will talk, and then at the end of each exhibit, before I quit, I'll ask you if you have any questions. We'll do it that way. I've been out here as director for 9 years, completing right now my 9th year. I worked here prior to that, back in the 80s, doing artwork and exhibits for the previous director. And when he decided to retire, Waylon came back and approached me. I was in banking, been in banking 17 years, and they approached me and asked me if I had an interest in coming back out. Well, I guarantee this is a lot more fun than banking, so it didn't take a whole lot of convincing. So I came back out, and I've never regretted it. We are what is considered a regional history museum. Now, there's a lot of different types of museums. Some of them are single focus, like a museum for a particular person. There's a lot of museums in the country from, regarding a historic home and the family that lived in them. There's a lot of museums dedicated to just a battle, like a Civil War battle and different things like that. So there's a lot of different museums, different types of museums, but we are a regional history, and by that, it was decided when we opened in 1976 that they thought the best thing to do was to become a regional history. Now, the region that we're talking about is the land that lies atop the Cap Rock. And this map here gives you an idea of what we're talking about. When you hear the phrase, the Llano Estacada, it's used in a lot of books. A lot of Western writers will use that terminology when they're in their books. Whether it's real history or not, the land that we live on is a very well-known area for history, going back to prehistoric man, the migrating Indians, Native Americans, the old cowboys, the cavalry. Just a whole lot of history took place on top of the Cap Rock here, and of course around the Cap Rock. But the area of land here, the aerial view, we are mostly in Texas, but we do branch over into New Mexico. And most of the area, there is a pretty big drop-off. The deepest area being Palagura Canyon. You come off of Lubbock going toward Post. It's not quite as deep, but it's still a definite break in most areas along the edge of the Cap Rock. Same in New Mexico. You get down in the Odessa Midland area, it kind of goes into a rolling plains, but for our purpose, just showing the definite drop-off is the easiest way for us to relate to people unfamiliar with the area about what we're talking about in the region we're talking about. Now, on this particular 3-step map here, we go back to the Ice Age. If you're familiar, if your parents are farmers or you're ag-related, you understand that we have a pocket of water, aquifer below us. The unfortunate thing about our aquifer, or body of water beneath us, is that we are not a constant refilling water source. And so that's why there's so much concern now with our farmers pumping water out of the ground, or different business industries that use so much water. In other areas of the country, that is a continuous feed, so their water sources are replenishing. But at the time of the Ice Age, this was the edge of the Rocky Mountains. And as the glaciers and the freeze and ice began to move and melt and push land mass, it came out of the mountains, and part of the land here is where we live. Our water source is the fact that there was ice, large amounts of ice that was captured beneath us. And so those became a very plentiful, and we thought for everlasting, water source at one time. But as you can see here, the water coming out of the mountains, this being the Canadian River, and this being on the east side of this, the Pecos River in New Mexico, these water sources coming out of the mountains over the years begin to cut and wash and erode to finally end up with the Llano Estacado, or the cap rock that we're living on. So this took place over thousands of years to come where we are now. It is still continuing to erode. I think we're all safe. I don't think it's going to fall away underneath us before while we're still living. So, but it is a constant erosion. Also, at one time, and it's really hard for us to think about this, but at one time in history of the world, this was actually a swampland as well. And so it's not uncommon for people to dig up fossils that are related to ocean, sea, water, those type of things. The predecessors to the alligators and crocodiles is a common thing you'll find in a lot of the regional museums where they have dug up bones or fragments of bones from the ancestors of crocodiles and alligators. Does anybody have any questions about this? Yes, sir. Yeah, these are all ancestors to our present day alligators. And yes, sir. This is a sea ship.
Pretty much. So what's that skeleton?
What would happen? They probably wouldn't like it here right now, as dry as it is. Nowadays you find them more in the south where you have swamp lands and constant source of water. We went from this to the Ice Age to, we're pretty much considered a desert area now. So, I mean, it's just the way time has evolved and everything. Yes, sir?
Is that like, that looks like tuna?
It's imprints of fish that was found in stone where they were in sediment when they died. And then it turned to stone over the years and people found them. And so those are real common finds up in this area.
Is that from the fossils?
Okay, here, if you just kind of look through, if those of you who get out and go camping and everything, these are just different types of rocks and things that you can find in our area. A lot of them are common to this area. Others were probably most likely pushed into our area during the Ice Age. Okay, right here, this is probably our most well-known or our most popular exhibit, and I say that because this particular exhibit, when it opened up that particular year, we had in excess of 11,000 visitors to the museum just to see this exhibit. This particular skull was found by a county employee driving a maintainer up in the eastern community toward Hereford. Luckily, he had sense enough to realize that when he was dragging the bar ditch and hit something, that he had sense enough to stop right there and realize that that was something out of the ordinary. And so at that time, this was back in the 80s, my predecessor as director here at the museum was an archaeologist. And he was the closest one and pretty well known in this region, so he was called at that time to come over and do the excavation of this particular skull. It was thought at the time that it was a woolly mammoth because that is the most popular mammoth type remains that are found in this area. What made this one so unique is that at the time that they unearthed it and really got to looking at it, they discovered it was larger than the woolly mammoth. So this one they determined to be an imperial mammoth, which was an older generation to the woolly mammoth that was around during the Ice Age. And so there are other skulls in this part of the country. WT has one that I can remember. I know at Crosbyton there's one or two more there that have been dug up in this region, but those are mammoth skulls. This one, as far as I know, is the only imperial mammoth in this area, as opposed to the more common woolly mammoth. So because when it was determined it was larger and where it was found and everything, the local media began to go out there every day as Eddie was unearthing and doing the careful excavation. And you really have to be an expert to get in there and dig up these artifacts without destroying them. There's a learned art that goes with that, and I'm not qualified to do it. So I knew Eddie at the time, and I kept up with it, and I helped him after he got it back to work on it some. But they had to go into the ground. They had to go up underneath it and build a platform under it before they could uncover the top. And then they built like you would break your leg, and they would put a cast on it. That's what they ended up doing to get it out of the ground and get it here where they could clean up and eventually build the exhibit. So it was very unique, and because the local news started carrying it, it went to the major affiliates because of the Lubbock and Amarillo stations, and that grew into a national attention. And so that's why the year that this opened, we had so many visitors coming in to see it. Archaeologists from all over the United States came in, and even years later, when I came back out here in 2004, I had people from New York and Atlanta and different places that still came by to see this particular exhibit because that was their interest. Anybody have any questions?
What about the mammoth tooth?
Pretty good size, isn't it?
Pretty big. It's pretty big. I wonder if
Yeah.
the tooth fairy could.
Yeah, probably didn't get much for that from the tooth fairy.
How big would you
If it were complete, I think I heard Eddie say he thought they would be at least 6 to 10 feet longer than what is there right now,
He's there now.
if they were complete.
Would that be the largest type of mammoth, or?
Again, that's out of my expertise, but as far as I'm aware of, the imperial mammoth would have been the larger of all species of mammoths. I think, as best I can tell, it was, what is it, about 12, 13 feet. That's a pretty good sized critter. I'd hate to be a man with a spear trying to bring one down for food.
Did you ever try to find the other parts of the body?
They looked around at the time they were digging and could not find anything other than the tooth. Now that could be that it during the Ice Age it may have died, and it may have been a glacier that actually brought it where it finally ended up. Or it could be that where it died, the lighter weight bones were moved by the ice. So, yes, sir.
What were the mammoth predators?
I'm sure it was the ancestor to the wolves and all of those same type things as today. As time goes on and you get the new generations, we're going to be talking about bison out here. Well, the ancestors to modern day buffalo were the bison. They were much bigger, huge horns, and you know, over time, all animals have gotten smaller and smaller. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Do you think those mammoths still alive?
This one?
Like other mammoths?
Oh, others? No, it's There wouldn't be much hiding places for them anymore. Here is as we started over there with the formation of the Llano Estacado to prehistoric life that was here. This is modern day life. We were talking a while ago about the antelope being a very common to this area. Also the prairie dog.
Y'all stay away from the glass.
The horny toad down there, you don't see a whole lot of those anymore. I was really amazed that some guy brought that one to me. So it's really unique. I've got a rattlesnake to put in there sometime, but I just haven't had time to do it. So. Okay, when we step out here onto the carpeted floor, from now on, we're going to be talking about when men came to this area, prehistoric men. Okay, we're going to be talking here about Plainview Man. How many of you realize that there is a prehistoric migrant man named after Plainview, Texas? You all familiar with that? Really? Okay. Back in the, I believe it was the late 30s, early 40s, there was a gentleman here as a young man, probably about your age. He's a retired photographer now. Any of y'all heard of Bill Weeks? As a boy here, he used to play on the draw out here a lot. You know where the Chevrolet house is now? Back behind there and across Joliet Street. He used to play there a lot as a boy, and one time when his cousin was here visiting, they were out there playing, and they stumbled upon some, points. Later, it was determined, that they, because they were different from any of the others that were found in this area, this was a common area back with prehistoric man because of the tall grasses. The playa lakes that were out here were a lot more plentiful and held a lot more water at that time. So herds of different animals, this case being bison, or as we were out there, the mammoths, would come through this area to graze, water, and then they would move on. The bison, the predecessor to our modern day buffalo, was no different. Migrant hunters would come through this area. It is determined as best they can. Obviously, nobody was here at the time. They did not have a written language at the time. It is as best as they could figure out because of ancestors to those with the modern day Indian and their hunting practices of the time, before they had access to the modern day guns and everything that was brought out here. One of their common ways of hunting was to find an area such as the draw out here, or if they were in mountainous areas, a place where there was a drop off or a cliff. These hunters would lay in the tall grass, and in the evenings, especially out here where there was water on the draw, and these bison would come toward the draw for the evening water and sleeping. What they would do would they would let them graze past them and get between the hunter and the edge of the draw out here. At the time, if you go out here, it's not much of a drop now, but at the time, they have, through digging and everything, have found out it was quite a bit deeper at this particular time. And so when the herd would get between them and the draw, they would suddenly come up out of the grass, waving hides, yelling, screaming, whatever they could do to spook them and try to stampede them toward the draw. Well, it wasn't a deep enough drop where it would kill them instantly when they dropped, but what they would hope for each evening was that enough of them would maybe possibly break a leg, or they would fall on top of each other and be stunned long enough that the hunters could come running down and spear them and kill them. And so if it was a small group of people or a large group, they would kill what they needed at the time. for food. And as long as they had food, they would stay in the area, and then they would move on. The reason that this particular man was named Plainview Man, the archaeologists that came in, what they discovered was they had already begun to suggest among themselves, people that studied early man, that migrant hunters came through this area. They knew they were on the coast, the East Coast, West Coast. Common thoughts at the time were that they would come during the time of year that the Bering Strait between Alaska and Russia would be dry, that the migrant hunters would come from overseas and hunt through part of the year and then return home. So the reason when they began to dig or excavate this particular kill site, they determined that the points that were left behind were different from any of the others that were found. When we get through talking here, you can take a quick look behind us there. You'll see that there was some other similar points that are there. Each particular tribe, what is common is that as the older hunters would teach the next generation how to make points, they would teach them the way they did it. So it turned out to be a very distinctive difference in each tribe, is they had their own way of making points. And so when this particular site was excavated the first time, the points were enough different, and they found whatever, they have a set rule for that. If they found X amount of points, X amount of bones, these type things, to determine that there was actually either a constant or a large band using the same type point and killing X amount of bison or whatever they were hunting at the time. If they had not been identified before, then they became identified with the community or the region where they were found. So, there's Folsom, there's Clovis Point, which is found over in New Mexico. This particular one this was the largest concentration of points that was found of this particular type. So this particular prehistoric man was determined to be called Plainview Man. So we're actually working at this time to raise funds, a joint effort between the city, the county, Wayland, and myself. We are in the early stages of planning an outdoor museum at the kill site out here. And so we hope to eventually have that done where people can come and they can get a better idea of what it looked like and what might have happened at the time. Most everything from the first excavation done in the 40s, late 30s, early 40s is in the Smithsonian at this time. What we have came from the second excavation, which was done in the mid-70s. Again, going back to Eddie Guffey, who was my predecessor being an archaeologist, he did the second excavation. And so what we have is mostly from the second excavation. Okay, any questions on any of that?
I can't get that stuff.
Get what stuff?
The one that's jumping off.
It's magic.
There's a pole.
It's museum magic.
I know how the pole sticking out. I know how the
There's a rod.
There's a pole sticking out.
Okay.
There's a rod. Yeah, I saw one where I saw that. This one.
Okay, as time progressed from this early hunter here, each kind of 2 or 3 generations of hunters, if you're really into history and that in time periods, each one is designated by different names, different time periods. This particular one being archaic. These were still migrant hunters, as we discussed, that came through for the Plainview Man. These are some of the tools that they would use. They would come and stay along the edge of the caprock, often finding washouts or caves that they could stay in for a few days. If they were just happened to be here during the season and could find grains or wild grass, wild wheat, any of those type of things that they could turn into bread. They would use stones to grind that, cook it. The at Llano here, that is an interesting tool, and I've seen videos of people using them. Those would actually, they would hook with the leather on their wrist. It would have a bone on it that would hook on the end of their spear, and by doing that, when they would throw, the atlatl would give them extra force when they would whip it. And so it would greatly increase the speed or velocity of their spear. And so it was a common a tool or weapon for many, many years. And a lot of people find remnants of those. At Crosbyton, I talk about Crosbyton a lot just because I was recently up there. They have a brand new collection that was given to their museum of 3 or 4 gentlemen that spent their life hunting for these things. And they finally decided to put them in their collections in one location. So there's hundreds and hundreds of points, spear points, arrowheads, different things, and different tools or weapons like these. And so, again, this is just another period of migrant hunters. The Neo-Indian, Neo-Age, these are actually, it would be the next time period where migrant hunters begin to stay in one place for longer. They became the early farmers. They would attempt to raise crops. They would attempt to build huts for permanent housing. And so these are just a few artifacts. They were the ones that probably developed more of the modern day, what we think of as an arrowhead. And they would turn bones or stone into tools that they would use. Again, the grinding slabs that we were talking about over here, they were the first to begin to make pottery. And so that again, it was a whole different time. And again, it was people that would migrate from other parts of the country to this area. Keep in mind that it's not like it is today with all everything, cities everywhere and everything. It was just a wild land with tall grasses, plenty of playa lakes for water. And so it was a great place for them as they were coming from other areas to come out here to fertile lands. And okay, here then the modern day Indian. And I apologize, we are doing a facelift on all of our exhibits, so my signs for all of these are down, but this would be the modern day Indian. I tell everybody this is the Indians I grew up watching on Saturday mornings with the Westerns, the Apache, Comanche, those type of things. But keep in mind that you can learn a lot from prehistoric Native Americans by studying them, because a lot of those traditions that they held truer to before today's generations were passed down from their fathers, who received the same stuff and ideas, ways of doing things from their grandparents to their grandparents. So it goes way back to prehistoric man. Okay, does anybody have any questions before we leave the Native Americans?
Where did I get the swords?
These are swords. These are dancing sticks from their ceremonial dances. That is a rock that was very common. You can get a very sharp edge with it. So it was really a preferred rock a lot of times for making knives and using it to cut with and skin.
What is that?
That is a decorative belt made out of gun shells. Again, a lot of this stuff is being modern day Indian. You will see them using similar things in their dancing, they do traditional dances.
So what is that big foot?
That's just scratched into stone.
How do they actually make the rock statue?
Well, obsidian here, much like flint, which is very common for arrowheads, those type of rocks. Those, again, you go back to generations of each one teaching them how to make those. They would strike objects. A lot of times it was horns or other rocks or things against the edges of other rocks, and it would split them. chip them off. Some rocks, like obsidian, are very adaptive to a very sharp edge. So that's why it's not real common out here, but when they could find it, it was very popular rock or whatever they would want to use
Do
it.
they make their boots out of hide?
Hide. Beads and things came along later as traders would come out here. They would make their own beads. As the Spanish explored this area, the Comancheros, those people who had items like that would come from back east, they would trade the Indians. When they had gold or silver, those type things that were the white man thought very valuable, they were just more rocks out here for the Native Americans. So it was easy to trade them with mirrors, pieces of steel, steel blades for knives, beads, very popular item, trade items. So.
I was told one time that those arrowheads, would they heat them and then drop water on them? Would that? I don't know if that.
I've never actually watched them make them. I've had people tell me, and most of the time it was done with stones or pieces of bone, different things like that. It's a developed art. If I just went out there, I might strike a piece of flint 400 times, and I might get one to chip. But and again, that goes back to what we talked about, identifying those early points. If you had a group of people who did it the same way all the time, and then they taught their kids to do it that way, and they taught their kids, that's why those particular points were always designated to a particular group.
Was that a?
It's rock that they would use to grind corn and stuff with.
Is that a bed made of rock?
A bed? No, that's a grinding stone. It's a real porous stone, and when they would have their corn, and again, go back and remember, this group is actually early farmers, and so they would raise grains if they could, and so they would grind them, and then when they had the meal that they would grind, they would make their breads and
How did they make all these stuff?
they were very patient people. It's not like today. I would have a hard time getting you to stand still for an hour if you and I sat down together to do something like that, because you're used to playing with video games, watching television, those type things. Remember, these people, they traveled, they hunted. During the day, if they weren't on an actual hunt or something, they had days and days of doing nothing. And so that's when their elders would teach them how to make arrowheads and things. You find a lot of areas where there's a large place up on a bluff or something where you find pieces, what looks like pieces of arrowheads. Is often as not, that is a place where they attempted to make arrowheads. If you get one nearly made, it would break, they'd throw it away, pick up another piece of stone. And whenever they could, when they were hunting, they would recover their arrows and use them again. But again, a lot of times when they'd shoot an arrow, if it hit bone or something, it would chip, so they couldn't use them again. So they were very adept at building, making their own things as they went, using whatever materials were available to them. For weaving, they would use the tall grass. They couldn't go down to Walmart and buy a spool of rope or twine. They did what they could. They would use the sticky parts from animals that they killed to use as glue even when they would wrap twine or grass, thin grass around to hold it to an arrow or a spearhead. So they learned, they were survivors. For most kids your age, because you all are being taught how to go out and you use things that you find while you're out camping or whatever. You're learning how to, which foods you can eat, wild, like dandelions, those type of things. You were learning similar type things to what these people were taught. Most of your classmates that are not scouts, if you took them out and suddenly y'all were lost, you all as Boy Scouts, because of your training, would have a better survival rate than most of your friends would. And so, again, it goes back to the same thing. You're being taught how to survive with what you have. And so that's what they did, generation after generation after generation. And the next case here goes into, brings up the subject of Spanish exploration. Coronada probably being the most well-known of those, but they were all very common in history lessons. You can see on the map of the Cap Rock that we started out pointing out in green up front. You can see all the trails of Spanish explorers that crossed out here. You know, you've heard of the lost city of gold, and that was rumored to be in the Americas. And Coronada and all these others would go back and forth all over. They would find an Indian tribe, and they would have chunks of gold or whatever, silver or whatever. And it always just stirred up this constant deal that there was this huge city out here full of gold and silver. And so there was a lot of exploration, Spanish exploration here over the years. The next exhibit here is, if you see on the right here, this is a copy of an early map. Most early settlements and map making and everything here in our area was done by military, different groups that were sent out here to explore. They had crude maps. I've looked at that from a lot of different angles, and I tell you, if that's what I had to go with, I'd be lost out here. But it was the early attempts. There's more things that actually go in this exhibit. It's kind of a funny story. People will donate, families will donate old things to us like this being old surveyors' equipment. What will happen to us is we will rarely build an exhibit on something that's been loaned to us. Because what will happen is in this case, I've got a big brass compass up in my office that actually was in this exhibit at one time. An older gentleman or a family member that has collected some of this stuff over the years will loan it to the museum. And it may be something great that we'd love to have. And in this case, an exhibit was built around this stuff. Well, then this gentleman died. One of his kids found out that we had this stuff. Well, they come and they want it because it belonged to their dad or their granddad or whatever. So since it was loaned to us, they take it out. Well, in this particular case, it was funny because another brother or sister later on, when that one died, found out that he took it out of the museum, so they brought it back. So I'm optimistically holding the compass that goes with this upstairs, just waiting to see if somebody else comes and wants it back before I get back in here and redo this exhibit. After the military began to come through, other people would come out here to settle up in New Mexico, Santa Fe, different places, down in Austin. Those areas were settled already. And so people would travel back and forth between them. And the Comancheros especially knew of this area, and they would collect things and come out here and try to trade. And we'll talk a little bit more about them in a minute. But these are some similar type things that have been found through different excavations over the years, things that would get lost along the trails as people would come out to this area and search for places to settle. Behind you here, the modern day buffalo. If you study much about the Native Americans, you'll always come to that point of the demise of the buffalo in our part of the country, meaning the demise of the Native Americans. That part of that was on purpose, part of a grand design, part of it was not. As Native Americans, the Comanches especially, other tribes out here, Apaches, different ones, but the Comanches adapted quicker than anybody because they would steal horses from the Spanish explorers when they'd come out here, and then they learned the art of breeding and continuing. Instead of eating the horses, they found out that they were better served, as use of transportation in war. So the Comanches pretty well ruled Texas from the top of Texas to Mexico, and they would even go into Mexico raiding and stealing more horses, raiding settlements, getting different things like that. And so if you ever want to pick just a particular tribe or to study, the Comanche to me is probably one of the more interesting because of their dominance of Texas for so many years. Later, they became so dominant that later the military realized what their main food source was. And so it was a combination of the military. It was decided that these coats made great, the wool or the hides from the buffalo made great winter coats. And when they discovered that, it was a big push for them on the eastern coast and in Canada. And so there was this huge inflow of buffalo hunters that came for nothing but the robes, the hides. And so it was this mass slaughtering of every buffalo herd, from here all the way up to Canada, which became the demise of the food source for most Native Americans. Over time, those hides were taken. Then as settlers came out, the middle part here, the hides would go. The wolves, which we have one in here that's mounted, you'll see in a minute, they got to where they would follow the buffalo hunters. I mean, they had a gravy train. These hunters would kill all these buffalo, and they would skin them and just leave the carcasses. The wolves would come out of the mountains and just follow them because they had this instant food source out here. So they would follow at a safe distance all these hunters. Well, then later with the settlers out here, and some of them were here at the same time, they discovered that since we had no trees, that the buffalo chips or the waste of the buffalo burned really good. So they would come out by the wagon loads just picking up buffalo chips, take them and keep them. And during the winter, they would burn those in their fireplaces because we didn't have trees out here for them to burn. Then at a later date, when they started farming and those type of things, they realized that the bones made great fertilizer. And so they would come up behind them and load wagons of bones that would be taken and processed and turned into fertilizer and different things. So anyway, there's a very interesting history with buffalo. There's a lot of groups now who are trying to start new herds and pure herds. At the Goodnight Ranch up here, there is a genetically pure herd that they have. Part of those off the Caprock at Caprock Park up here. But up north in Montana, Wyoming, those type of places, they are really working to rebuild those herds and keep them genetically pure as possible. Move over here. This is probably for everybody your age. This is probably the most popular exhibit. Unfortunately, it's so big you can't put it behind glass, but please, whenever you're in museums and different things, don't climb over and get into exhibits. I can't tell you how many times over the years we've had to run kids and even sometimes parents out of these exhibits because they want to get into them. You cannot enjoy them if we cover something that's large behind glass. And so we have a few open exhibits. And occasionally, I think probably right now, if you really look, you see a few footprints in there where people have come in and they've crawled in there. But please, in the future, when you're in museums, please don't do that. This is a full-size recreation of a teepee. This particular one made of canvas rather than the hides. After Anglos came and began to make fabric with the cotton gins, different things like that in the South, or in the North, and they raised cotton in the South. That's a whole other story with the Civil War. But after canvas became available, it was a very common or preferred fabric for teepee. Would insulate their teepee in the winter. That actually comes up about halfway. Inside during the winter, if they were in one area, they would cut grass, different things like that, take into their teepee and stuff to build an insulation from the outdoors. And I've actually been in one before, wintertime, with fire inside. They actually hold heat pretty well. The flaps were very adjustable, depending on which way the wind was blowing, to draw the smoke out. So they knew what they were doing. Again, generation after generation of doing things, learning rights and wrongs, and those things being passed on. Unfortunately, just as we came around the corner, the light went out on this. We do have a few exhibit cases that I haven't had time to upgrade the lighting. They get hot, they go out, they cool off, they come back on a little bit. I noticed just as we walked around the corner, this one went off. So might be a little hard to see. A breastplate and some old guns, a bow and an axe, some different things that were used. Behind you here, the Comancheros, another very interesting study if you into history. And the Comancheros were actually a pretty ruthless group of people. And I guess they had to be for survival because they were dealing with the Indians on one hand, and they were dealing with soldiers, different people. They were kind of the merchants of their time. You can see on the bluff inside there some different things that the Indians would love to get their hands on. Metal knife blades, beads, a metal axe handle, or blade, bales, different trinkets that they could use. So they were pretty adept, and even when they could get them weapons, at coming and trading with the Indians and getting things that were very valuable to white settlers, going back again to gold and silver and some of those type things. So the Comancheros would travel with their ox carts. And a lot of times what they would do, it'd be a pretty good group of them. They would have a place that they would regularly meet with tribes or a group that they would trade with. Well, a lot of times they would hide part of their stash so that when they got together, it wasn't this temptation for them to kill them and take everything. They would have a small assortment of things that they could trade. And after they would go on, they would go back and recover what they had hidden and go on to the next spot, try to trade with some more. So again, and they were actually some of the first ones in this area that actually dealt with slave trade. If they could, a lot of times find settlers, if they would raid them and kill them, take the women or the children and turn them into slaves, trade them to the Indians, different things like that. So they again were a big part of our history for this area.